thank you so much for having us, Irv.
You're quite welcome.
Well,
When you write a new book, you want everybody to know about it, so I'm glad to do it.
well, you just published your autobiography, Becoming Myself. And at the end of the 6th chapter, I believe, you write that memoirs are far more fictional than we would like to think. And so I'd like to start by asking you, what's the memoirist's motivation, if not to tell the truth?
Oh, well, I have a very strong desire to tell the truth, but the question is whether my memory really collaborates with that. I'm talking about the ancient past, of course, but even so, even more recent things, people will remember it in extremely different ways than I do. Fortunately, I have a life companion, my wife, who's been with me for most of my 86 years. So, she can help out with that, but, her memory too is flawed. So sometimes we remember entirely different things.
Well, at least in 4 of your books, Existential Psychotherapy, Love's Executioners, Staring at the Sun, and Gift of Therapy, you cite John Gardner's novel Grendel in the sentence, everything fades and alternatives exclude. So I was wondering, how does writing one's autobiography inevitably heighten one's awareness of what you've excluded from your own life?
Well, that's not an easy question to answer. What did I sense in writing that? I had a sense when writing that perhaps I could have spent more time with my children when I was young. As I look back over the large number of books I've written and the time that's required from that, I must have taken time that I could have devoted to them more. Although I don't hear them complain of it. But what else have I excluded from my life? Well, that's a John Gardner quote, alternatives exclude. I've chosen to be a scholar and a writer and a therapist, so what have I excluded as a result of including it? It's a good question. I suspect I've partied less than other people. I've taken, I won't say fewer vacations, because my vacations are always tied in with writing. I always like to go to a beautiful place and spend time there writing part of the day and part of the time visiting. So I am not sure I can really answer what I've excluded here.
That sounds like a very good sign to me. In the recent documentary on your life, on Yalom's Cure, one of your opening lines is that the more we know ourselves, the better lives we can live. So I was kind of wondering, through the process of actually writing this autobiography, did you get a feeling of also getting to know yourself better? Did you surprise yourself through going through this process?
Did I surprise myself in writing about this? I think I surprised myself a little bit. I think I became much more aware of the kind of deprivation that I had as a young person. Mm. I really had, as I looked at it very closely now, my first 14, 15, 16 years were pretty great deprivation. I was living in a terrible neighborhood. I had very few educated adults around me, anyone that would take me in hand or tell me what to read or any of these things. So I've been a little bit more interested in the impact of early life, or even very early life, than I have been for a while now, as I think about that. These are times that are early in life, pre-verbal, but the atmosphere and the environment that I was exposed to was not good. I'm not blaming my parents. They were unfortunate as well not to have had any education and to have been very impoverished. And if I think I work hard, I have to take a look at my father, who put 12-hour days and 6 days a week always.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably one of the real things that I've been aware of the amount of deprivation my early life was, and how hard I had to work to climb out of that.
Yeah, essentially, it's interesting you mentioned your father. One thing that struck me as I was reading the book, you mentioned how much time your father spent in his grocery store, and but also that you knew that he used to write poetry for long hours before coming to the United States.
Yes. Well, that's a part of his youth, and I know that from talking to one of his good friends who came over with him and told me about the youth. But I've never ever found any of my father's poetry or talked to him about that.
Mm-hmm.
He had a book, a notebook and it was all written in Yiddish, which I didn't read. And I found that a few years ago, and I finally found a professor at Stanford who was a expert in reading Yiddish. And it turned out to be that these were words of songs that he liked to sing, not the songs he wrote. So I found this land, this really treasure in which I would see his poetry, but I was disappointed not to find so. But I know that by the time he was 16, taken by the Russian army at that point, he never had any time to follow his interest in that way.
Yeah. Do you think the unlived lives of our parents also can have a major impact, or in your specific case?
I think I have a very strong sense of my parents having unlived life.
Mm-hmm.
But look where they came from, from impoverished small villages, shtetls they're called in Russia, they come over to the United States. That itself was a huge leap.
Yeah.
And I think they were very proud of what I was able to do.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And at the same time, you've spoken so much about how you grew up with this feeling of not having actual roots or foundations. Is that correct?
That's right. No roots or foundations, because of as I hear, more recent children, they talk about the table conversations they had with their parents and the books that their parents were asking them to read. I had none of that. It was all sort of self-driven, and but there was a lot of drive, and several of my colleagues and friends did the same thing that I did, and we worked tremendously hard.
Yeah, I remember in the book you mentioned how your wife Marilyn, when she describes the memory with her own father, that you kind of feel like you were betrayed by life in a way.
That's right. Her father was a half generation ahead. So he came to this country as an adolescent. So he could have his adolescence here. And he learned to enjoy music and listen to operas. My father did like music very much and did like to sing, but he was never exposed to classical music. Well, I had a burning desire to know a great deal about my field and about the fields which were the roots of my field. For example, philosophy, and I worked really hard to get an education. It didn't come in my regular education. I was too busy getting into medical school. But after I got into medical school, after I became a psychiatrist, that's when I became a student again and started attending a lot of undergraduate classes, both at Johns Hopkins and as a resident at Stanford. I sat in on classes, many, many years.
Yeah. I mean, you did that wonderful video program recently with your own son for psychotherapy.net, and you go over it, some of the many people that you've met along the way. So you really get the feeling that in your life you both had a lot of imaginary mentors and a lot of actual real life mentors.
I sometimes consider myself not having mentors, but being totally self-created. But yes, as I think back and as I was writing this book, I see there were mentors. They didn't come along until I'd say I was a psychiatric resident. There are no mentors before that. No mentors in medical school that I could really think of, and no mentors in undergraduate college. No teacher knew my name. I was never close to anyone. I went to a college with very large classes and never had any mentoring there.
But then Jerry Frank and Rollo May.
They came along in my residency. Jerry Frank did. And Rollo May's first book came along in my residency. But my wife was a very important kind of mentor for me because she was deeply grounded in the humanities,
Mm.
and one of the things that bound us together right away was our reading books together. So I consider her a kind of mentor, not in my field, but a mentor in the humanities for
Yeah,
sure.
we could wonder how much do we owe Marilyn your psychotherapy expertise.
It could be. She
Ah,
got me reading Kafka and Camus. Well, those were the people she did her PhD dissertation on. So naturally, I'm going to be kind of interested in the people that she's writing and reading and writing. And that was my introduction, really, to the existentialists. I started reading Kafka and Camus and then others as well.
uh-huh, uh-huh. And one thing that's very interesting in your own career is that even though you were drinking from all of these influences, at the same time, you strike me as someone who never really wanted to be associated with any model or approach of therapy. Is that correct?
No, I did not.
Mm-hmm.
I really did not want to be associated with any model. The main model to be exposed to in my time was psychoanalysis, and
Mm-hmm.
as I described there, I had a 700-hour immersion in personal analysis, and I realized that this is not the model that I felt was effective or that I wanted to use. So I deliberately did not get into any other institution because I wanted to have the freedom of experimenting myself. And I was very fortunate enough to be at Stanford with a chairman who really wanted me to use my own imagination and ingenuity. So I was free to try all kinds of different approaches.
And nowadays there are existential therapists, but I know that you have a mixed feeling towards that idea, right?
Well, I can't understand quite how one can be an existential therapist when people come to you with marital problems or come to you for other kinds of issues. I think there are some patients for which these existential factors are tremendously important, but there are others for whom it is not.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got to know a lot more than existential theory and practice to work with your general patients.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. When you think about effective therapists, or if you were to select therapists, what do you think are kind of the defining characteristics you would look for?
Well, I go back a very long way back to Carl Rogers. He made a tremendous um, really contribution to our field, and with this great emphasis on saying that the really crucial factors in therapy are the nature of the relationship
Mm-hmm.
between patients and the therapist. And the therapist has got to be someone in his triad, with genuine empathy and with positive, unconditional regard uh, for the patient, and and be able to be genuine in his relationship with him.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think those are things that, I mean, I haven't relied on those, but those are things I've come to see that I feel are important
Mm-hmm.
too. And we do a lot of talk about, empirically validated research, but nothing is more empirically validated than those factors.
Mm-hmm.
There are hundreds and hundreds of dissertations written with students researching those factors. So if I had to select a therapist, I would select someone who could really be willing and able to really have an intimate relationship with this patient.
How much do you think that throughout your career, looking back, how much do you think this is an actually trainable skill to be able to actually be intimately and create intimate relationships in therapy?
I think it is trainable, but I think you're off to a head start if you can start off with people who already have it. Carl Rogers at one point said, I think therapists probably should be more selective than just trained.
Uh-huh.
You're going to have these factors there, but I know I've changed a great deal through my own work, and I've seen many of my students who have done that as well.
Uh-huh.
So, but that's why I'm a great spokesman for continuous therapy. I think therapists need to have a lot of personal therapy, and I think it should be never ending. They should continue from time to time going back into therapy or being. I've written in there at length about this long-term leaderless therapy group that I've been.
Yes.
It's the first time I've written about that, but whenever I talk about it, it's a message I want to give out to therapists.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's so important for them.
Mm-hmm. And at the same time, when people read your books, there's always the question, not only are they for therapists in some way, but also a question comes up of how much do you believe your own books were part of a self-analysis or some exercise towards also yourself? And at one point in Staring at the Sun, you talk about Julius from Schopenhauer's Cure and saying that he showed you the way in certain ways.
Yes. Yes, that's right. While you're raising the question, can you learn from your characters?
Yes.
I think so. I create certain characters, 7 characters in that group, and I had no idea where they'd go. I created these characters, they're each different, and then I kind of looked in and see what was going to happen with the group. You know, your characters, and many writers have said this, I'm not unusual in this regard, many characters, you set them out and then you watch what they do and you record it.
I'm reminded of Karen Horney's self-analysis book. I'm thinking, what are the limits of that, of self-analysis, self-writing?
Yeah. Right. There are limits. You need
you need other people.
You need feedback, and I learned that from all my work in group therapy.
By the way, speaking of your work in group therapy, I think that after this autobiography, that's something that you would like to now work on, the revision of the textbook. Is that correct?
I have an extremely good collaborator, man, who collaborated on my last edition, named Nolan Lesh. We've already started that.
But you've said that this was your last book. How does a writer at heart deal with that?
Well, I can't really stop. You know, I do get ideas, and I think, well, this would be right. And I'm feeling a little pressed right now because I'm having so much email that comes in from readers, and I really want to be writing something. So for the evolution of psychotherapy, this big conference in Anaheim, I didn't quite know what I would do there because people already have read the memoir. So I set about and I wrote 2 short stories, and I read those there. So I will write stories, I think, but I don't have a sense that I'll be doing a book of them. But I enjoy the writing process a great deal.
Okay, so people can still look forward to some writing.
I hope so.
I'm imagining that some people would have some surprise to know that after some initial reservations, you actually have come to embrace some recent developments such as online therapy and text therapy.
Because we're running out of time, but I was extremely negative and uncordial to that whole development because I pressed so much emphasis on the nature of the intimate relationship. But I was called in to supervise some people, and I was curious about it, and so I looked into it and been supervising a couple of people who were doing this for a long time, and I can see that it's not the kind of therapy that I do, but it can't be dismissed. There are people who get things out of this, and so I read all the interchanges. One of the things about this kind of text therapy, the entire text of therapy is available, and I can see people do some changing. They value things. So it's not my kind of therapy exactly, but it is that. But curiously enough, the people that I've been supervising, are people who are using their engagement with the patients as well. So, curious sort of way, this most impersonal of all therapies is far more personal than cognitive behavioral therapy or things like that, where there is so little real engagement.
So you did find a relationship there. It's possible.
That's right.
Yeah.
So focus on the relationship is really possible.
So one last question I'd like to ask you. Nietzsche's eternal return thought experiment is kind of a recurring theme in your books. And you've read it out loud to patients, I believe. So I think it would be fitting to end this interview on a Nietzschean question, which is, would you be willing to repeat your life as you have lived it over and over again?
Yeah, my answer to that is definitely yes. Yeah, I had no choice about how I lived the first part of my life. But that Nietzschean question is a really important question. It's closely related to a question I always do ask patients, the question of regrets, and what do they regret about their life? And as I think about my adult life and my last last 40, 50 years, I don't have any regrets. I
Mm.
feel I've been uh, an overachiever. I've written all the books I wanted to write. I never imagined I could do this and been useful for so many people. It's still hard to really think of that, but people tell me every day in email, so I know that I've been helpful. So I don't have regrets about the way I've been living my life.
Mhm.
I'm living quite a regret-free life right now.
Mhm. And your autobiography kind of consolidated that feeling.
That's right. It definitely did.
Okay. Sure. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thanks so much for these engaging questions.